right. Welcome to this evening's episode of Talks at New Haven. I'm one of your hosts, Josh Robinson, and joining me today, as always, is my co-host,
Alton Booth.
And on today's episode, Alton and I are going to be discussing Genesis chapter 11. We're going to be discussing the Tower of Babel. We're probably not going to go too in-depth on the Tower of Babel since we went into depth last week, and then this morning's sermon, I don't know how long I preached. I felt like I was up there forever talking about the Tower of Babel.
Everybody else felt like you were up there forever, too.
So, New Haven church people have gotten a lot of Tower of Babel the past few weeks. So, but we're planning on we're going to touch over it, but then we're going to finish off the chapter looking at the descendants of Shem, getting into Terah and then Abram and some of the Toledoter genealogy there. So, but before we do that, Alton, how you feeling today, pal?
Doing pretty good. We had a good time this morning.
Yeah.
Got a nice nap in while you talked about the Tower of Babel.
Good.
All of that
good,
stuff.
Good.
No, we had a good turnout this morning.
Yeah.
We had a lot of fun, and then just after church, got to spend some time with family.
Good.
That kind of thing. So it was a pretty good day.
Well, that's good. I did not get a nap in. Around the time that my wife got back from doing some photography this evening, I was on the verge of a nap in the recliner, and then I was like, now I get to go and talk for 3 more hours. So
right.
just kidding. I'm not going to talk for 3 hours. I'm going to try really hard not to. But anyway, so if you've got your Bibles this evening, you can go ahead and open up to Genesis chapter 11. I'll read the entire chapter for us, and so we'll take it from the top. It said, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. They said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' They had brick for stone, bitumen for mortar. They said, 'Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the whole earth.' And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, 'Behold, they are one people, and they have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech.' So the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. These are the generations of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after he fathered Arpachshad 500 years and had other sons and daughters. When Arpachshad had lived 35 years, he fathered Shelah. And Arpachshad lived after he had fathered Shelah 403 years and had other sons and daughters. And when Shelah had lived 30 years, he fathered Eber. And Shelah lived after he fathered Eber 403 years, after he had other sons and daughters. When Eber lived 34 years, he fathered Peleg. And Eber lived and fathered Peleg for 430 years and had other sons and daughters. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he fathered Reu. And Peleg lived after he fathered Reu 209 years. He had other sons and daughters. And when Reu had lived 32 years, he fathered Sereg. And Reu lived after he fathered Sereg 207 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Sereg had lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor. And Sereg lived after he fathered Nahor 200 years and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he fathered Terah. And Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years, and then he had other sons and daughters. When Terah had lived for 70 years, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and Iscah. Now Sarah was barren, and she had no child. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and then Terah died in Haran. And that's our text for this evening. So we'll just take it from the top, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Yeah, so we'll start right here at the beginning of chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel story.
Yeah.
And like you said, we're not going to spend a lot of time
Yeah.
on the Tower of Babel. We've covered it pretty extensively in the last week or so here at New Haven Church, between last week's podcast and this Sunday and then Thursday night's service.
Yeah.
We've spent a lot of time talking about it, so we're not going to spend a ton of time here.
Yeah.
So starting in verse 1, we see, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. So this is after the flood. People have not dispersed like they were instructed to.
Right.
They're all staying together. They're all speaking the same language. Now, I believe that they're all staying together because they're all speaking the same language, which is kind of the conclusion that God makes as well.
Yeah.
It's not that they're all speaking the same language because they stayed together.
Right.
They're staying together because they speak
the same language.
There's no reason to not work together at this point.
That's right.
So verse 2 says, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. So this time, there's people are migrating from the east.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit backward.
Yeah.
It's almost like we've talked about, they left the garden, right?
Yep.
Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden to the east. Then they were kicked out of there and they moved further east.
Yep.
And we keep seeing people move further east, but now at this point, for the Tower of Babel, we see them migrating from the east.
Right.
They're trying to move back toward the garden
Yeah.
to go and build their city.
Yeah, which is actually really going to make sense of some of the construction of the Tower of Babel whenever we get to that here in the next few verses. I'll go ahead and save that until we get there. But basically what's going on, though, is it's going to try to be a man-made construction of the holy mountain of Eden, which is,
Right.
yeah.
So verse 3, and they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. So this is just saying how they built.
Right, the materials that they're using.
Right. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's pretty interesting there, because they're coming together to build a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens. So we'll touch on the city part first. So this is very reminiscent of Genesis chapter 4, which we talked about last week. So basically what we've got going on here is it's kind of like a recapitulation in some ways. So we saw that after the fall of Adam, his descendants go to the east, and Cain builds a city.
Right.
Okay, he's the first city builder. He's, the culture maker, that whole thing, right? And so what we've got going on here is similar in some way. So we've got this eastness theme kind of playing out here again. But now we've talked about the fall of Adam, or the fall of Noah as the new Adam. Now his descendants are doing the same thing as Adam's descendants. They are now building a city, which is, again, very reminiscent of Genesis chapter 4. So that's not all they build, though. They also build a tower with the top in the heavens. And so this is the Tower of Babel. And so most of the Bibles that you look at, study Bibles or commentaries, suggest that this tower is a ziggurat. And basically what a ziggurat is it's very similar to a pyramid, okay? So pyramid is an Egyptian version of the same thing. It's basically a holy mountain, is basically what it is. So I was turned on to this by James B. Jordan in his book, Through New Eyes. So basically what it is it serves as a high place, right? So here's a picture of a ziggurat. You guys can't see it there, but Alton can see it. But basically what it is it's a step pyramid. And on the top of it, in the heavens, which is high ground, right? What it is there is a temple that sits on the top of it. Now you got to think about what happens in a temple. You have a priest who mediates between heaven and earth, and God comes down. That's what's going to happen in Israel's temple later on. The theophanic glory cloud is going to come down, and it's going to reside in the Holy of Holies, in the temple. So that's what's going on here. However, keep in mind, this is a man-made attempt of reaching the heavens. All of the holy mountains that we've seen earlier, so it's basically a man-made version of Eden. So think about it. Like we've talked about it, like what resides at the top of Eden? We learned it was on a mountain. It's a high place, right? But what resides on the top there? There is the tree of life, the garden, right? And then after that, we've got, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then we got the tree of figs, that whole thing. But we learned that the garden was at the top of the mountain, and that was the place where God came and walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. Okay? So notice here, God's doing this on his own terms. Right? This is God condescending to man. The Tower of Babel is the inversion of this. It's the opposite of that. This is man trying to ascend to heaven. So basically what they're doing here is they're building a place to have communion with God. Now the interesting thing that's about to happen is God's going to come down.
Right.
But he's not going to come down and be pleased. He's going to come down in judgment and condemnation.
Right. And so man trying to use this to build a temple, for lack of better words, to reach God, makes a lot of sense from verse 3, when you see them say, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly."
Yep.
So they're specifically stating, okay, we're going to use these materials
To build this. That's right.
Now, when we get the tabernacle instructions later, and even after that, the instructions for the temple, God is very specific in materials to be used.
Very, very specific.
So I think it's interesting here that they're specifically saying, okay, here's the materials we're using.
Yep.
To build this temple, and we're deciding to use these materials.
That's exactly right. So God, later on, in Exodus, whenever he gives the plans for the tabernacle, and then later on whenever he gives, the plans for the temple to Solomon and all that, like, he's very, very particular. Like even down to the colors of threads and coverings that are supposed to be made, even the vessels that are supposed to be in there. Like, he's very, very particular. And even with the decorations, on how the decorations are going to be on the walls, he talks about having, the pomegranate trees and that type of stuff. So it's basically man trying to ascend to God on his own terms, deciding that he's going to be the arbiter of how this is going to work.
Right.
So
then we get down into finishing up verse 4.
Yeah.
Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens.
Let us make a name for ourselves."
Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.
Yeah.
So they're saying here, okay, we know we received the command that we're supposed to go out and spread out across the earth.
Yeah.
But if we make ourselves important enough, we can't be split up. Right? That's basically what they're saying here. If we do these great things, we can't be split up and sent to other places. We're too useful when we're all together.
That's right. Yeah, it's better for us to be together than to spread out. It's more practical for us to stay together because we can accomplish so much when we're together. So
right. So then verse 5 says, "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men had built."
So they built the tower with its top in the heavens to bring God down, and God does come down.
Right.
But he's coming down, as we're about to see in verse 6. It's not because he's pleased.
Right. So the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do." So then he finishes it up with, "And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them."
Yeah.
So what's he getting at there?
Yeah. So here's what I kind of think that he's getting at. I think that he's getting at that whatever evil intentions that they want to do, as long as they're together, like, they're going to be able to accomplish it. So they're supposed to spread out over the earth. That's God's design here, right? That's his intention for what they would do, to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. But whenever they come together as one and they're doing it out of this sinful desire to reach the heavens, nothing is impossible for them anymore. Like, it's almost in some ways like corrupted dominion. They're supposed to go out and take dominion over the earth, right? But whenever they're here together, it's like they're doing that, but it's not the right kind of doing that, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I would say. Let me see here. Let me dive into it a little bit more. But yeah, he says this is the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose now will be impossible for them. But yeah. So.
Right. So like you were saying with the corrupted dominion.
Yeah.
So what was the purpose of Adam and Eve having dominion? so that they could take care of the things that God had given to them for the glory of God.
Yeah.
Now, that's not exactly what they're doing when they're taking dominion here.
No.
They're not using these things for the glory of God. They're not taking care of the good things God has given them.
I just thought of something. So I've been thinking about this ever since you asked me the question. And I hadn't thought about this morning. I'm thinking about it, just thought about this. So they're supposed to go into all the earth and turn the whole thing into a temple.
Right.
Right. So it's kind of like earlier, whenever you heard about when we were in Genesis earlier, you had the Garden of Eden, but then it talks about all these other lands, like you got Havilah, which is good, and it's got gold, and it's got all these other places, right? And so what they should have done, basically, James Jordan talks about what they were supposed to have done was to go from those places and to go to these other places and build a garden temple in those places.
Right.
So what you've got here is the opposite of this in some ways. So instead of them spreading out, taking dominion, setting up temples, holy mountains, all over the place to worship God, they're all here together. And this is going to serve as like a utopian mega city kind of deal, right? So you've kind of got that going on here in some ways, and then that God's like condemning this, and it's not fulfilling his command either to see the whole earth become a temple to him. It's all just concentrated in this one place. And city building, again, is associated at this point with the lineage of Cain. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So getting down into verse 7.
I thought that was the most challenging part of this text, honestly.
We're going to see here in verse 7, "Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech."
Yeah.
So first we see, "Come, let us go down." So we talked about this a little bit before we came on. The book of Genesis, we see us used from God multiple times, right? And you always have to figure out, is it a Trinitarian us?
Yeah.
Or is it a divine counsel us?
Yeah. I think in this particular passage, it is a divine counsel us. And here's the reason why I think that it's a divine counsel us. In Deuteronomy 32, chapter 32, verse 8, we learn that God hands the nations over who are coming together here at Babel. He hands them over to the sons of God. Now, according to Psalm 82, which we can maybe talk about or hit on after that, we learn that these sons of God are a part of God's divine counsel. Okay, so in Deuteronomy 32, 8, we read this last week, but we'll go ahead and read it again here, just for the sake of context. It says, "When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind," this is at the Tower of Babel, this is Moses commenting on it, "when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the numbers of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage." Now, we've already talked about the term sons of God. We talked about it last week. In Hebrew, this is the term B'nai Elohim, okay? And every time that the term B'nai Elohim is used in the Hebrew Bible, it's always in reference to angelic beings, okay? Now, we've got commentary on this. So, in Psalm 82, we learn there that these sons of God who have been installed over the nations, basically what their purpose is to be angelic mediators. We talked about this last week. If you want more details on it, go back and see last week's episode. But what we learn that happens is they end up becoming the gods of the nations. Now, how does that happen? Well, it's not because it was God's design. So what they were supposed to do is they were supposed to be mediators over the nations. They were supposed to mediate over the nations and lead these people to the one true God. And they were also supposed to, angels are messengers.
Right.
That's what the word angel means, is messenger. So they were to be messengers between God and these nations, which has been disinherited. Okay? So we talked about this last week again. Think about what happens when you're disinherited. What happens? You usually no longer talk to anybody in your family. Messages usually come through other people. That's what's going on here. So, but what we learn happens here is this. These angelic beings, like the sons of God in Genesis 6 that we've already looked at, they turn and rebel against the one true God, and then this is where paganism finds its origin in the Bible. So if you've ever wondered, hey, well, I wonder where the other gods where did they come from? This is the Bible's account for how this happens. It happens at the Tower of Babel with these sons of God who rebel against God. Now, Psalm 82 talks about this. It says, "God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, little g gods, he holds judgment." How long will you judge unjustly, show partiality to the wicked, give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted, the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked? They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They, talking about the nations, walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High. There's the connection to Deuteronomy 32. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die, and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, and you shall inherit the nations. So, again, there's the connection to Genesis 11 with the nations, right? So, basically, though, this is what's going on. They've been handed over to the sons of God. The sons of God have rebelled against God. They were members of his divine council. They've rebelled against him. He holds them in judgment. And he says that he is going to be the one who at some point is going to inherit all the nations. But that's why I think that the let us come down is divine council language, because God gives them over to members of his divine council. So.
Right. And so, yeah, I tend to agree with you on that, that it is divine council language. I don't see any, I don't want to say I don't see any, I don't see real evidence for it being Trinitarian.
Yeah.
Because usually when things are Trinitarian, you see the effect of all three members of the Trinity in that area. Now, you could make the argument that it could be Trinitarian because the Holy Spirit could be involved in confusing the language, because the Holy Spirit is who comes to undo the confusion of language in Acts 2. So I could see that argument being made.
Yeah.
But I think that it being divine counsel holds a lot more weight.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. Especially just given Moses' commentary on Deuteronomy 32.
Right.
Like, we know that there are spiritual beings involved in this event. So I think that it makes sense.
Yeah. So then in verse 8, we see, so the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth.
Yep.
So we see God coming down with the divine council and confusing the language of the people. They all wake up one day, they can't understand each other anymore.
Yep.
They throw their hands up in frustration, and they're finished with the city, and they all just leave.
Yeah.
They find people that they can understand, and they follow them, and they go to new places.
I imagine that one of those bricks that was talked about here at the beginning of this, one of those guys probably dropped it on their foot and cussed, and whenever he went to cuss, he probably spoke a different language that nobody ever heard, and he's like, you know?
So they just found people that spoke their language, followed them into different countries.
Yeah. Caravan out.
So it's interesting how abruptly that story ends.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's a reason that Moses ended it that abruptly, or if he just didn't have anything else to say on the matter.
No.
But then we get down into verse 10.
Yeah.
And here, verse 10 through verse 26, there's not going to be a lot in this passage.
Yeah.
There's one thing that I noticed in this, and we'll talk about that as we go.
Yeah.
But we talked about right before the flood,
Yep.
the people not living as long. Correct? That was in Genesis 6.
Yep.
Right.
It's been a while ago now.
So we talked about people not living as long on the earth. Right? Lifespan's becoming shorter. And we're also getting farther away from Eden.
Yep.
So we're getting farther away from people that had presumably eaten of the tree of life at some point. So we're going to see lifespans start to get shorter. So that's kind of what we'll look at in this genealogy.
And I also want to say that I think that this division here, where you have this Toledot, is now moving forward in recapitulating Genesis chapter 5. So you have the story of Cain and the city that he builds in Genesis 4, just like the city that's built here in Genesis 11. Then after that, it moves to a Toledot, and you see the descendants from Adam all the way up to Noah.
Right.
So the story's moving forward. That's what's about to happen with this Toledot, or this genealogy, too.
Right.
It's going to move to Abram.
And after we finish this genealogy, we'll kind of touch on the significance of that move forward. So in verse 10, it says, "These are the generations of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after he fathered Arpachshad 500 years and had other sons and daughters." So that's 600 years, right?
Yep.
That's how old Shem was. When Arpachshad had lived 35 years, he fathered Shelah.
We're starting to father children now at a way younger age.
Right.
Like, the other ones are like hundreds of years old.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're at 35.
Right. So, when Arpachshad had lived 35 years, he fathered Shelah. And Arpachshad lived after he fathered Shelah 403 years and had other sons and daughters. Mm-hmm. So we're down to 438 now.
Yep.
When Shelah had lived 30 years, he fathered Eber. And Shelah lived after he fathered Eber 403 years and had other sons and daughters. So there's 433 years old. Mm-hmm. When Eber had lived 34 years, he fathered Peleg. And Eber lived after he fathered Peleg 430 years and had other sons and daughters. So we're back up to 464.
Yep.
We're still down significantly from the 900s we were at in Genesis 5.
That's right.
When Peleg had lived 30 years, he fathered Reu. And Peleg lived after he fathered Reu 209 years and had other sons and daughters. We're down to 239 years old now.
Yep.
When Reu had lived 32 years, he fathered Serug. And Reu lived after he fathered Serug 207 years and had other sons and daughters.
Okay.
So 239 again.
Yep.
When Serug had lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor. And Serug lived after he fathered Nahor 200 years and had other sons and daughters. Mm-hmm. So we're at 230 there.
Yep.
And now we're going to see it getting significantly shorter.
Yep.
When Nahor lived 29 years, he fathered Terah. And Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years and had other sons and daughters. So we are at 158 years.
Yeah, big drop.
Is that right?
Yep, I think so.
148 years.
There we go. You're close.
So we see significant decrease in lifespan at this point.
Yep.
Then verse 26, when Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran.
Yep.
So we see it kind of breaking the cycle of how it's been telling the story
Yep.
when we get here. So that kind of says to me, okay, the fast forward is done. Mm-hmm. So just like in Genesis 5, when we see kind of the fall of Cain, and then we see the lineage of Cain and all the destruction that they did in Genesis 4, then we get to Genesis 5, and we get that genealogy that kind of fast forwards us through that destruction and to the Messiah figure.
Yep.
To the Christ figure that will save people from that destruction. It's the same thing here in Genesis 11.
Yep.
So we see the destruction of that line through the Tower of Babel. And then we see the fast forwarding from that destruction and that fall of man at the Tower of Babel up to the next Messiah or Christ figure who will be part of what saves the people.
Yep.
In Abram, mentioned here in verse 26.
Yep, that's exactly what's going on. So Abram is going to become our next big character that we're going to be looking at, and the call of him starts in Genesis chapter 12, and he's going to be called out of this land, out of the land of his fathers, and then he's going to be called to go into a land that God will show him, which is later on going to be, he's going to end up in Canaan and that whole thing, which is going to eventually be Israel.
Right.
But yeah, so we're fixing to look into the origins of the people of Israel, and that's why Moses is recording this. Like he's trying to show where are we from? Like who did we come from? So this is some of what that's serving. So
right. So then we get to verse 27. So we see there in 26 that Terah lived 70 years and fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran.
Right.
So we have the three sons of Terah. Now, it's going to be a little bit different once we get to 27.
Yeah.
We're going to see, now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. So then it says, Haran died in the presence of his father Terah, in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans.
Yep.
So, it doesn't mention anything about Haran's age. But it mentions specifically where he died.
Yeah.
And who was there when he died. And we talked about the significance of that, and we were both kind of puzzled for a minute on that before we came on the air.
Yeah.
And then I think we may have figured out the significance of why that's mentioned when it's not mentioned for anybody else.
Yeah.
And we'll see that in verse 31.
Yeah.
So there's going to be some really strange stuff happening in the next couple verses. Mm-hmm. So in verse 29, and Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah.
Yeah.
So Milcah was the daughter of Haran, who was the brother of Nahor.
Yeah.
So that was his niece. Unless there were multiple Harans.
Yeah, no, it doesn't look like it. So.
And then we see in verse 30, now Sarai was barren. She had no child. Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's going to be very significant
later
on.
Yep.
So we're going to get down to verse 31 now. It says, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson. Mm-hmm. So there we see the significance of mentioning where Haran was killed.
Yep.
Or where he died, and who was there. Because now we see that Terah has taken Lot under his wing, has taken responsibility for Lot.
Yep.
Which is going to lead to some things in the future. It's going to lead to why Abram tries so desperately to save Lot. Mm-hmm. Once we get down into chapter 14,
yeah,
we're going to see that because they were kind of raised as brothers, almost, it looks like.
Yeah, pretty much. Also, there's a land of Haran later on whenever you get through here in the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. It's down a little bit west of Ararat. So you kind of got migrating, it looks like, towards the Promised Land here a little bit later on, which is going to make sense of how they're going to get down into Canaan.
And we're actually going to see in verse 32 that is where Terah dies.
Yeah.
Is in Haran.
Yeah, so Haran is right there at the top. So here's this sliver of land here. You guys can't see it on there, but Alton can see it. This sliver right here is going to be the Holy Land, and then Haran is right here up towards the top. Mm-hmm. So going on here in verse 31, so Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. And they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. Mm-hmm. But when they came to Haran, they settled there.
Yeah. So this is the first instance we see of a people moving toward Canaan.
Yep.
Now, like you said, that's going to be the Promised Land. Mm-hmm. That is the land that when God in the next chapter, in chapter 12, calls Abram out of the paganism that he is practicing with his family at this time, calls him out and calls him to follow God.
Yeah.
And
go into
basically
the land.
Starts the nation of Israel in chapter 12. He tells him to go into the land of Canaan. Mm-hmm. That's where they were headed, and for some reason, they stopped.
Stopped in Haran, yeah. Yep. I would love to know why they stopped in Haran. Like, is it just that Terah is sick? Or is he too old? Can he not go on anymore? Who knows?
Right, because it does specifically mention that that's where Terah died.
Yep.
Is in Haran. So is Terah not well enough to travel?
Yeah.
And then you've got, I would imagine, you're starting to run into some problems with having enough people around you to help with things.
Yeah.
Because it just says that Terah took Abram, Lot, and Sarai, right?
Yeah.
Well, Sarai can't have children.
Right.
Lot doesn't have a wife that is mentioned at this point.
Right.
I don't think Lot has a wife until chapter 13.
Yeah.
After Lot and Abram separate, then Lot gets a wife. So they're not producing children in this small little group of people that's moving along.
Yeah. Yep. So, possibly a lot of circumstances that maybe are keeping them at this point from going further down into Canaan. Because we see here that obviously it was their intentions to go there. Mm-hmm. But something's holding them back. We don't know, but...
And then probably the best guess at what's holding them back is the providence of God.
Yep.
Because Canaan is the Holy Land.
That's right.
These are practicing pagans.
And we're going to learn later on that there are going to be interesting characters in the land of Canaan.
Right.
Among the tribes who are there, which we've talked about last week with the Hivites, the Girgashites, all the tribes that come out of the Canaanites. So, but ultimately, we can say what we do know for sure: it is the providence of God keeping them from going.
Right. So in this passage, we have a couple different Christ figures that we see, or at least a couple different instances of the gospel that can be applied in this passage. And also, I was wanting to mention something earlier, and I completely forgot.
Yeah.
So when you're reading this passage, there's a book that I was reading. I can't remember what it was. We were reading it for our Sunday school class with the teenagers. And it sets up a way, like a lens to view everything through. A biblical lens. The lens of creation, fall, redemption, restoration.
Yep.
I think that this is a very good passage to look at through that lens.
Yeah.
So you have the lens of creation. You have not only the creation of the original Eden, but you have man's creation of a new Eden, of a new promised land.
That's right.
You have the fall you can look at, which is man rebelling against God.
Yeah.
Man taking what God is supposed to do and putting himself in that place.
Yeah.
You have the redemption.
Yeah.
We're going to see that in chapter 12 with Abram. We're going to see man being redeemed, but then we're going to see that again
That's exactly
at
right.
the cross.
Yep.
Then we're going to see that again in Acts chapter 2. We're going to see that throughout the New Testament as we see, we talked about in midweek service this week. We talked about the gospel being preached in Ephesus, and then the gospel being carried from Ephesus to Colossae.
Yep.
We talked about how the gospel was carried from one nation to another nation to another nation, reversing the curse of the nations being separated.
Yep.
And then we finally see it through the lens of restoration.
Yeah.
Once we get to Revelation, and we see every tribe, every tongue, and every nation standing together, hands joined, singing praises to God.
That's right. Yep. That's good. Yep. So that pretty much brings us to the end of this narrative. I mean, the Toledot there is meant to, as you said earlier, show us that the story is progressing forward. So now we're leaving the time and the era of Noah and his descendants. Now we're coming to the time of Abraham, and it's going to take us into the time of the patriarchs.
Right.
So that's where we're going to be at next week once we hit Genesis chapter 12. So this pattern, too, is going to end up getting repeated in the story of Abraham, too. You're going to kind of see, like, he's calling him out of this old creation, this fallen creation, to start a new creation, which is going to be the people of Israel. And so some of these themes that we've been talking about so far going to also get recapitulated in the story of Abraham, but in some new ways. There's going to be the Holy Mount there again, too, at Mount Moriah, where he's going to be called to sacrifice his son on an altar on top of the mountain, which kind of replays the altar that Noah builds on top of Mount Ararat. But God calls him to refrain, and obviously this is pointing to the son that he would sacrifice, that he would not refrain from sacrificing, right? And Mount Moriah is also going to be a place later on where the temple is going to be built. So Christ is the temple. There's going to be all kinds of fun connections once we get there. So
So these genealogies have kind of jumped us from character to character throughout the first 11 chapters here. Now we're going to kind of settle in with Abraham.
Yeah, for a while.
Abraham for a while. Up until Abraham's death is in chapter 25.
Yeah. The rest of the story, I mean, Abraham's probably going to catch the majority of the rest of the story of Genesis.
Right.
And then his son, and then his grandson after that, and then it's going to end with one of the sons of his grandson, Joseph, and then that's going to take us into Egypt for the Exodus. So we're about to spend a significant amount of time learning about Abraham and his family. So.
We are, yeah. And it's going to be a lot of fun digging into Abraham a little more and digging into kind of some kind of some Jewish history. It's going to be really interesting. There's going to be some stuff there that I'm sure that I haven't seen before.
I would say that Abraham,
or that I haven't noticed before.
Yeah, that's me too. I would say that for right now, as of right now, Abraham is probably one of the characters that I'm least familiar with in Genesis. I've read a lot of people on the first, well, it's really, Genesis is really divided into the first 11 chapters, and then 12 onwards is a whole different section of the book. Even commentaries are shaped that way.
Right. Commentaries on Genesis 1 through 11,
yep.
and then 12 through, 50?
50 something. Yeah, I think it's 50. And so we finished the first half of the book, the first part of the book. Now we're going to start the second half of the book, and we're going to be here for a minute.
Things are going to slow down a lot.
They're going to slow down significantly.
Once we get to this part of the book, there's going to be more detail, and that's because Moses, as an Israelite, is writing the history of the Israelites, starting with the man who was the first Israelite. So there's going to be a lot more detail that was kept.
You know what we're about to talk a lot about? Circumcision.
We are. We are.
Yep. So we're about to make some people uncomfortable.
I'm going to get very much into circumcision for the next probably couple months.
I got a question for you. Why? So I was talking about this the other day with Derek, and we were talking. The thing that sets an Israelite apart from a Gentile is he's circumcised, right? Like whenever you see David versus Goliath, he's like, this uncircumcised Philistine,
right, that's something I've always wondered is why is that something that was so easily noticeable as soon as you saw a man?
That's the question that I have. Is it like a handshake in the ancient world? Would you just maybe you show the goods? I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't either.
Maybe Trimper Longman will have an answer on that for us.
Yeah, maybe he will. So
we'll find out.
I don't have anything else to say. I can't say anything else after that.
So yeah, we'll be moving on in Genesis. We'll be talking about Abram and then later Abraham and all of that. So if you all have any questions about Genesis, about the first 11 chapters so far, if you have anything about Abraham that you would like us to specifically touch on, feel free to let us know. If you have anything else that you would like us to specifically touch on, let us know.
Oh my god. Gosh.
If you all didn't listen in on the podcast feed this week,
oh boy,
audio only, this past Thursday we had an episode release on misconceptions about heaven. It was a really fun episode, talking about a lot of different things that people believe about heaven that aren't necessarily true.
Yeah.
Things that people believe about hell that aren't necessarily true.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of fun.
Right.
If you want to give us any ideas for any off-topic episodes, feel free to get those to us. You can send us comments here on the video, on Facebook, or on YouTube. You can send us an email. You can go to our website, newhavenwv.com, click the resources tab at the top of the page, and then Talks at New Haven. And there's a form there where you can submit emails. Or you can go to our Instagram page, Talks at New Haven, and you can send us any questions you have there. So that is all that I've got for you this week.
Yeah, that's all that I've got too. So we'll see you guys next week.
All right, see you next week.
See you then.